Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hi, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
I want to put this book up. This is called River of Darkness. It is not the only book that Buddy has written, but it's the one that we're going to talk about today. And it is such a fascinating tale. It's how come this has largely been forgotten, Buddy? I mean, I know you got a chance to really tell the tale again, but why are we just not learning about this 500 years later?
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought you were going to mean why has it been forgotten? Since the hardback to the paperback. But no, I mean, I think that's a great question, Pete, because I do notice that there has been a kind of resurgence in interest in South and Latin American literature. There's a guy named Andre Resendez who wrote a book about Cabeza de Vaca that is called A Land So Strange, and it's really doing well. And the same thing there, I think there's just with global interest in adventure tales, maybe people, during the pandemic, reading a lot more has something to do with it. But I mean, I have to say, when I wrote this book, it was, to me, one of the most remarkable adventure stories that I had ever come across. And it came on the tail end of having written a book about the conquest of Mexico. So I was totally fired up and I was really interested in the subject matter. And it's good to see that there's been a kind of swing around to these sorts of stories, So hopefully with the re-release of the story, it won't be forgotten. It'll be remembered.
Yeah. Yeah. And like a guy like Carvajal who took notes, he's the primary source for you. Is that right? Can we talk about him for a minute?
Yeah, well, it was very common during the conquest for the Spaniards were really smart about bringing along scribes, and a lot of times they were priests who kept really elaborate records of everything that was going on. And there were a couple of reasons for this. One was legal, so that when the conquistadors would do whatever it is they were going to do, which was expanding empire and claiming lands for the crown, they had this written record of it. And so in the case of Cortez's conquest of Mexico, he sort of set the precedent where he was sending back really elaborate letters to the king that would, in a way, justify the kinds of maneuvers and decisions he made, because you have to remember that they're so far away and correspondence took so long that a lot of times these transcribed letters and accounts of what they were doing had a legalese element to them, but also were in ways justifications of their decisions. And so Carvajal, who was the man who traveled along with Francisco Orellana down the Amazon, his primary job was to record in great detail all of the events and where they were and what they were doing and who they were encountering.
That is it fair to believe that Orellana's venture down the entirety of that through the whole Amazon basin, is he the first person to ever do that? I know there's a lot of millions of native folks there, but why would they ever do something like this, start at the very top and go all the way through?
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting. That's why, the title of the book, it says First Journey, and I make sure to mention that in other places, it's the first Europeans to descend the Amazon. Certainly the indigenous populations were moving and had been moving up and down the river and its many tributaries for thousands of years. but you're right that there would be no real point to try to descend the entirety of the river from top to bottom, nor would it be very practical to do so, because in places the river is moving so fast and with so much volume that going upstream without power is impracticable, And so, yeah, what I always found rather remarkable about Orellana's journey is that, it was the result of desires for gold and cinnamon, and then after a number of blunders, then it becomes a sort of accidental discovery and accidental journey that ends up being one of the most amazing adventures of all time. But it wasn't as if they set out with that in mind.
Yeah.
They weren't trying to make it to the bottom until it became clear that was their only option.
Yeah. And this wasn't like they went to North Face ahead of time and said, let's get outfitted and all these things. They just ended up on this thing almost accidentally, not really even accidentally on purpose. Like this just sort of happened.
Yeah, well, let me talk about that for a second. So there was an expedition that had been planned, so you've got in context all of these. This is in 1541, and like I said, Cortez had laid siege to the Aztec Empire in about 1519 to 1521, and then after that, the Spaniards had this great appetite for gold and expansion that continued on. Some of the conquistadors, and then so there's this other faction, Francisco Pizarro and his brothers, who were often described as the brothers of doom, not only because of what ended up happening to them all, but like they were really brutal in their tactics. I mean, so was Cortez, but when you get over to South America and the Spaniards who are beginning to infiltrate around Panama, and they had made inroads into Colombia and Venezuela, and it just so happened that, and Peru, and it so happened that at the time that Orellana was there in Peru, he was a relative of Pizarro's, and Francisco Pizarro had earlier conquered the Inca Empire, right? So you've got all of these Spaniards setting up, making cities, and they've got this incredible lust for gold because the Aztecs and the Incas have yielded great stores of gold for the Spanish crown, and so all these conquistadors are showing up around in near Lima, Peru, and in Quito, and they're reporting that there's gold in every direction, essentially. And a number of these indigenous people used gold to make elaborate jewelry, but they didn't care about gold nearly to the extent that the Europeans did. So once these conquistadors are all talking shop, they realized Gonzalo Pizarro, who was Francisco Pizarro's one of his brothers, decides to he hears tales of this person called El Dorado, this golden man, and he's and the rumor is that the golden man, is daily coated in this sort of powder, sticky powder, and then he's anointed with gold dust. And he looks like a gilded golden man, and then every day he bathes in this lake, and he's done it so many times that the lake bottom is rumored to be sort of covered with a silt that's actually gold dust, right? And the Spaniards are in such a frenzy that they kind of buy this tale, and it may or may not have been the case that there was some ceremony involving anointing a king with gold dust, but at any rate, they hear that he's somewhere over the Andes and downstream, right? And additionally, that there are great stands of cinnamon that the Europeans really prize. So they set up this really large expedition, and Gonzalo Pizarro takes on Francisco Orellana as his second in command, and then the plan is to go over the Andes and then find this cinnamon and this golden man. That's the plan.
That's the plan.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the brutality and conquistadors in general. We have this sort of like block where we go, Columbus was bad, and then we shut down, and we don't understand that there was a Balboa and a Cortez and another Cortez, all these different people. And then also we talk about their brutality. I don't know if there's a better way to do it. I mean, the captains that didn't come back because they weren't brutal enough or they didn't win the battle, okay, remember that Cook died and that's about it. But when you have, 100 dudes and you show up somewhere where there's 5 million people or however many people there are, it's awfully hard to stay alive without some sense of, like dominance, right? And I'm not making excuses for bad behavior, but we tend to lose. We don't care about like the next level of knowledge and understanding what it means to go on a ship and go somewhere. And then I guess add to that, was it possible for this discovery to be anything other than brutal?
Wow, that's a really great question because I mean, if you look at it, in the context of what the conquistadors were encountering, right? So, in many cases, they're encountering places that they've never been before, right? So you're talking about arrival in ships and then landing on a place you've never been. And in certain cases, the indigenous populations were curious. In certain places, they were just immediately hostile. And then, you've got, you're just immediately in a combative sequence, right? So it's like, what are you going to do? And obviously Cortez has set this sort of precedent where, he unloads horses and then, begins firing cannons and these musket-like arms called harquebuses, right? So to illustrate that we have a military dominance here, once they figured out that the people they were encountering primarily had, arrows, bows and arrows, and then these darts that they could throw with these atlotls, these sling throwers. And so, I mean, the Spaniards were and felt outnumbered pretty much everywhere they went. Initially, on the shores of Mexico, and then casting forward to Orellana and his expedition. Once he's floating down the Amazon River, he's very vulnerable because, and I'll cast back in a minute to like sort of what happened and how they got to the situation they were in. But he's quite vulnerable because unlike Cortez, Orellana's in a boat, and then he doesn't have a lot of weaponry. He only has 57 men at the beginning once they had separated from Gonzalo Pizarro. And so every landing there's a sense of deep vulnerability. And that also contributed, I think, as I look at it and have thought about it, to Francisco Orellana's approach, which ended up being quite a bit less violent and brutal, at least in his initial attempts, than, say, Cortez and the Pizarro brothers, who sort of killed, maimed, and tortured first, and then asked questions, where Francisco Pizarro tried to land, make communication, make peace, and then if that didn't work, would resort to warfare if necessary. I hope that answers your question.
Well, and then is there a better way, like, was possible back then? Like, and then I guess the other question is in the book you talk about the language capacity of Orellana. Was that one of the reasons why he was brought along and put into that role? Because it's remarkable how gifted he was in that. So could there have been a less brutal outcome, or was this just this? That's just how humans work, do you think? And then the language capacity.
Yeah. Okay. That, again, really good question. And I think I keep casting back to Cortez because there's some precedents that were set there, and language bears on it. So what Cortez learned, early on in his foray from the banks of Veracruz in Mexico up over the mountains to Mexico City, he had been gifted a native speaking slave girl who ends up being instrumental in his ability to she was multilingual and learned Spanish quickly. So he was able to communicate with the people he was encountering and make alliances and figure out which tribes had problems with the Aztec Empire and so he ended up being able to co-opt large numbers of fighting men and bearers and porters. In the case of Orellana, it isn't really clear how because there's not a lot of information about his early life. He sort of appears from the records. We learn most about him, and he's already just about 30, and he's already in Peru. So, but it does look like, because of his that he grew up as a member of the relative of the Pizarro family, that he was probably educated. His adoption of language is really quite stunning, and the ability that he had, because there's a record by Carvajal of Orellana as he's moving down the river, taking notes and interviewing people and learning language and writing it down phonetically so that he is able to communicate, and at least in a rudimentary way, which is really helpful in sort of when you first encounter people, so that you can at least convey to them that you mean no harm. You're trying to move down the river, and that you're not hoping to conquer their lands. You're just trying to understand where you're going, because they were lost. So I think and casting back just for a second to how sort of what happened initially. Gonzalo Pizarro and Orellana are going to trek over the Andes from Quito, and it's about 9,000, almost 10,000 feet, the city of Quito, and then in separate groups, and then meet up over the Andes at sort of the beginning of the headwaters of the Amazon, in this place near what they believe is the land of cinnamon. And so they have this retinue of the 400 horses hundreds of horses, 400 swine that they're herding up over the mountains, thousands of native bearers that which is a sort of a euphemism for slaves, right, that they've enlisted to help them carry all their crap over the mountains, and then they're going to meet up. The problem is, they didn't really understand where they were going, so they encounter challenges from the beginning. For one thing, I've been over the pass. I followed the route of the conquistadors from Quito all the way to Iquitos, Peru, down the Amazon, which is only about a fifth of the distance too. I mean, it's remarkable how big it is. And so once they regroup and get together, a lot of the bearers have run away because they were poorly clad. They didn't have much clothes, and it's 14,000 feet at the pass, so it's really cold up there and snowy. And they encounter a volcano, and earthquakes, and so the indigenous people have scattered. By the time they get to the headwaters of the Amazon, they've lost quite a number of their horses. They've eaten all the swine, and they're really kind of almost out of food. And then the horses aren't able to walk along the river because it's really boggy and the forest is flooded, and it's just not it's not, they were using the model that Cortez has set up with using horses, but the terrain is so different and not conducive to horseback that they're figuring that out on the fly, you know?
Yeah. So not poorly provisioned now and improperly provisioned is like these two things have met up. And when the whole thing starts, isn't part of their mission to go out and find some food?
Well, right. So what ends up happening is right about that point where, I mean, this is months into the journey. They're on the river, and they're at sort of the headwaters of what are called the Coco and Napo rivers. There are something like 500 tributaries that actually filter into the main Amazon, and so it's really the river's Amazon, there's not one river, but the main river. Once they reach it, they're almost out of food, and it's around Christmas time, 1541, and they have this big decision to make. Some of the people they've encountered, and by this time Gonzalo Pizarro has started using the tactic of grabbing whoever they encounter and then torturing them to find out, like, where's this golden man, where are larger populations of people, and where's food. And so partly driven by just the need to not be tortured, the indigenous people are just pointing downstream and going, like, a few days down there, there's these plantations of food, go there and quit burning my feet. But Orellana decides that he'll propose to Pizarro that he'll take this boat that they've built called the San Pedro and 57 of the men and head downstream, try to find this food, and then the rest of Pizarro and his men, and I forget the exact number that are left, but it's like 80 maybe, are going to wait for Orellana's return. And so Orellana starts down the river, and it becomes clear within a couple of days. It's moving very quickly. They realize we're not going to be able to go back upstream. There's no way to row it. It's just too. So he presses on. They're supposed to come back in 12 days. He presses on, and they do in fact find these manioc. It's like a very root tuber food that's a staple, plantations, but there's no way to go back. So after a couple of weeks, Gonzalo Pizarro determines that Orellana is a traitor, and he starts trekking back. Somehow in his mind, he's going to trek back up over the mountains and return to Quito. And so at that point, the narrative splits, and I focus on Orellana's journey headlong downstream, periodically cutting back to what's happening with Gonzalo Pizarro trying to, what's called like the worst trek in the Indies. It's just a miserable few months slog through rainforest and jungle and mountains trying to get back. And he's now vowed that if he ever sees Orellana again, he's going to behead him because he's a traitor, even though Orellana didn't really have any choice. Oh, hold on, your volume went off.
Yeah, this is this accidental voyage that happens for Orellana, and also, Pizarro is stuck going back over. He doesn't know what else to do too, and they both end up going on these horrible odysseys.
Yeah, I would say that on balance, Gonzalo Pizarro's odyssey was worse in the sense that he's not discovering anything. So once they split and Orellana is now moving downstream, he understands that that everything he's encountering now is new, and if he can survive, he's going to be able to report back to the king and to the world, essentially, like, I have discovered new lands, and in the way from Cortez to Francisco Pizarro, all of this has worked very well for them because they've become, fabulously wealthy by taking over these lands. So Orellana, even though he knows, like, it's a different situation because he has no horses, he has limited weaponry and ammunition, but he is on a journey of discovery now. So I think that also plays into his different approach once he knows, okay, I'm not going to see Gonzalo Pizarro again for a long, long time. No knowing how long. But my job is to get these men down the river and report what I have learned.
It's not an insignificant thing that he makes this decision, even if it was forced upon him. He knows that there's a good chance that he'll get hung at the end of this whole thing, or killed, and in some way, because you don't get to take off on your captain, right?
So, well, Rick, I mean, he doesn't make that many references to, nor does Carvajal, his scribe, to his own fears about it. But I mean, I think he understands that I may have some explaining to do if I survive, but I'm going to worry about that later, because his immediate concerns are significant, right? I mean, they're quite vulnerable. When you cruise along the river, and I had the great fortune of doing this, kind of trying to mimic at least a portion of the journey. So I trekked partly and took buses partly over the Andes, and then stayed on at the summit for a few days. And then once I got down to the headwaters of the Coca and the Napo rivers, I had hired a guide, two guides actually, and floated down the Amazon in a dugout canoe for 3 weeks, cruising through the Yasuni National Park, which is just this stupendous bioreserve, where you're seeing pink dolphins, freshwater pink dolphins, and scarlet macaws. And then we got onto the river and spent the whole time camping in the rainforest and sleeping in hammocks between trees. So I was trying to get a sense of what it was like for Orellana and his men, even though there's some, suspension of disbelief. But I will say, even to this day, I mean, there are stretches that are so remote and unpopulated that it probably resembled something like what Orellana and his men were encountering. Though, the people along the riverbanks were not hostile. That I was, and some of the people that Orellana was running into were not hostile either. I'm just grabbing the book here, but yeah. So anyway, they, I think Orellana's immediate concerns were documenting, surviving, documenting, and then knowing that his only real shot at conquest in the traditional sense that the Spaniards thought of that was going to have to be later, because he wasn't going to be able to do it on this journey. He just didn't have the manpower or the weaponry.
Yeah. I just want to hold the book up again here too. This is River of Darkness. There's a link there on the page. There'll be one in the show notes if you're listening on the podcast side. And I just thoroughly enjoyed this. And it's not his only book, by the way. So we'll be having Buddy back on the show. Okay, so these guys are floating down the river. How did they get a boat if they were walking over a mountain pass with a bunch of pigs and horses? How did they get a boat? I mean, did they portage a ship over the top of the mountains? Or?
No, that's a great question. There's a precedent that Cortez has set where he did portage. He built boats, then portaged them over 50 miles, and rebuilt them in a lake, and then laid siege on Tenochtitlan. But what Orellana did was at one of the earlier villages that was not hostile to them, they actually let them stay there, let the men stay there for nearly a month.
Wow.
And so they built a boat. And what was really cool is that, they were smart enough to know that they were going to need some metal. So they retained, as every time they had to kill a horse, they removed the horse shoes and the nails for the shoes, and they retained all that metal. And at one of these villages, they actually, harvested trees, cut the timber, planed out boards, and then built a ship. And they built a forge along the river and melted down all of this metal that they had retained. And they were having to use other, not only the horseshoes, but like some of their metal that they had brought either for trade or that they were, some of their weapons. And ultimately, they had enough to make nails to nail the ship together. And then they also had to use a lot of their cotton clothing for the caulking between the boards so that it wouldn't leak. And it was it's amazing how they pulled this off, because not only that was the boat worthy, but they ultimately down at the very bottom near the Atlantic, retrofitted it into sailing vessels. So they built another one, and then took to the ocean. So it was, when you think of it, how clever some of these and handy and mechanically oriented just the average person was to be able to survive.
It's amazing. When you did your trip, I mean, this is modern times. Sure, you're in a dugout, canoe, and all that kind of thing. But how challenging was it? I mean, look, Teddy Roosevelt ultimately dies because of his trip down the Amazon. So these aren't easy things to do even in modern times. How hard was it for you guys?
Well, I mean, I luckily I was with two local guides from Ecuador who knew the region well, and what was amazing to me was how comfortable they felt. Obviously traveling along the river, because when you look at pictures of the Amazon, it in different sections, I mean, it looks like this big, languid, slow-moving river. But when you get to places where other rivers are coming in, the churning water, and there's also sometimes giant bobbing trees that have come down from other rivers, and they're the size of trucks and houses. There are big ceiba trees that are floating along that you have to navigate around. But where I was most impressed was sort of in the forests themselves, because once you see these walls of trees, and then you realize when you enter into them, it's this whole other world. And so there's all sorts of things to contend with, like I mean, some things seem small, but like nowadays when you go down the Amazon, you wear knee-high rubber boots because the ground is just covered in ants, right? And they're all over you. And then there are, we bumped into some trees where spiders fell off the bark of the trees and into the dugout canoe, and the spiders were like half again the size of my hand.
Wow.
And then there are anacondas 30 feet long in the forest, the largest constrictor, and vampire bats that bite your scalp, and then they have a anticoagulating serum in their saliva that keeps the blood flowing, so they just lick at your head all night long.
God.
And so these guys, I'm sleeping in a pretty modern a hammock that had a mosquito netting, but of course, and Orellana and his men had none of that.
None of that.
But I will say the local guides I was traveling with didn't use mosquito netting. They just got used to it. But there's all sorts of unknown creatures and jaguars and howler monkeys. So it's pretty. One of the things that really I hope works in the book is that I spent a lot of time in the forest listening, so that I could recreate the sounds of the thousands of insects that are, creaking and chirping at night, and then the sounds of howler monkeys and all of that. So it kind of brings it to life.
Yeah. Well, and when you read the book, one of the things I really enjoyed about it was that you would have us on the river long enough to get our interest in that, and then you would put us on land, and then it was like a whole new story each time they did that. It was like, self-writing chapters, right? This tribe, that tribe. One of the things I find interesting about this whole thing is Carvajal's record has been available for a long time, and the archaeologists, anthropologists, they largely, at least for a long time, like disregarded it and didn't understand that Terrapreta exists and that there were millions of people in this basin, and we just are blown away when we hear this story. And so I guess maybe it's just it's so far fetched that the academics couldn't believe it. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a couple things going on there. I'm glad you brought that up because I had the great pleasure of interviewing and spending an evening with a woman named Anna Roosevelt, who with the University of Chicago, who is Teddy Roosevelt's great granddaughter. I hope I have that right. It's in the back matter of the book. But anyway, so one of the things that's problematic is that in a lot of places where ancient civilizations have left their ruins, the stone is in really good condition, and because of the nature of the Amazon and the way because of humidity and the fact that there isn't as much stone, so many of the ruins are sort of they're wooden and they decompose, right? So there are places that they've found like that, and they also get subsumed ultimately by the jungle. I mean, you hear of certain places that are ultimately found because they've it's been hard to see them. They've been covered in this vast canopy of jungle. But so right along the riverbanks, Orellana and Carvajal describe running into cities that have like you mentioned, thousands of people in them, and they're only they're there for a few days, and then they see these roads heading inland, but they're not able to they're not really able to go deep into the rainforest. They have to kind of stick along the river. But they're seeing evidence of very large populations and quite organized populations, some of whom have built not on the order of Tenochtitlan in Mexico City in terms of its complexity, but still supporting vast populations. And so archaeologists are beginning to and have been for the last couple decades bearing out by the like pottery shards and things that they're finding that they're and mounds that they're finding, and they're like, wait a minute, Orellana was right. Like there were large populations of people here. And I think that's also contributes to a renewed interest in the topic, because you start thinking like, what did it look like then?
Yeah. And then what do they choose to bring? I mean, obviously they've only got so much capacity to lift and move things, and so you want to bring things back to say, hey, we really were here. And then they must be trading things to survive. So what about the things that they brought and then got rid of? Like, how valuable were the things that they had still?
Yeah, well, that's a problem. Whereas, again, they did not have very much in terms of trade goods. And you're talking like, things like shirts, sometimes combs and scissors and things that might not have been actually very useful to the people they're trying to trade with. And usually in Orellana's case, they mainly wanted food, because he had determined pretty early on that he doesn't have a vessel that has the capacity to carry much more. And in fact, some of the tribes that he's encountering are shooting at them with bows and arrows and poison tree frog darts,
Whoa.
And so Orellana was thinking, I'm going to come back. I'll go, somehow make it back to Spain, report everything, and then convince the king to let me come back, which he did. But on the way down, they were not able to bring very much at all, like that they found. A few weapons here and there, which were rather rudimentary. But I have to say, I mentioned those tree frog darts. These were really a problem because, and they found out about them the hard way. Like they're riding along in the boat and get hit as they go along a bank, and they see a horde of angry-looking indigenous people who start shooting darts at them and arrows. one of the guys got hit in the leg, and they pulled it out, but it thought it was just an arrow. Or when I say dart, they're like shorter arrows that are thrown with sticks. But it turns out that they would dip the tips in this poison that they extract from a particular tree frog, and within minutes, the person's leg starts to bloat up, and then it becomes necrotic and black, and they die within like 2 days of just agonizing death. And so at that point, they got more wood along the way, and they built up some barricades on the outside of the boat. So when they came to people huddled along the beach, they would duck under these barricades and see how it went. Yeah.
This is so, and they started with 58 guys. How many did they finish with?
They only lost. I think I forget the exact number, but I believe they only lost like 3 or 4 men. Orellana did. Pizarro lost more, but Orellana was able to, because, like I said, he had adapted some language. He was able to talk his way out of problems most of the time. And then they had a couple really, really close scrapes, including the one that, of course, everybody is most interested in is this encounter with the Amazon women.
Yeah.
And so, they had engaged in a very large battle at one village, and some of the men, including Carbajal, noticed that there were like a dozen really tall warriors who were clearly women, and they presumably, according to the record, fought like 10 men, and they killed a few of them. And at that village, they took a prisoner, this guy who was a trumpeter, and he wasn't part. He was part of like blowing the trumpets for alarm when people were coming. So they snagged him, and through the interpreter and through Orellana's language, got this tale from him. And he told them that these women lived days upstream. And what was interesting is that the tradition of the Amazons dates back to Greek mythology and was well established by the Europeans, that there were these warrior women and who took men only to reproduce. And then the story they get from this trumpeter is really similar. And he's telling them that these women live upstream. They take men when they want to reproduce, and then if they have a boy, they either kill him or send him away, and if they have a girl, they keep him. And you could make the case that Carvajal knows the story from Greek mythology and is making it up. But the way they tell it is pretty tantalizing. Actually, it's called The Trumpeter's Tale, and it's a chapter in River of Darkness. It's one of my favorites.
How many close calls would you say where it's like, boy, that easily could have gone all the way bad for us? Because we are talking frozen dark, and it can't be that the food is all easily like edible. I mean, it's hard to survive when you don't know how to prepare things.
Yeah. Well, so they had from the time they left, I would say they were in a constant state of peril, really. That's one of the reasons that it sort of keeps you going from chapter to chapter, because you think, I don't know how they're going to survive this.
Right.
But they learned a few things the hard way too. Like at one point, some of the people in Orellana's group arrive at a village that's been abandoned. There's quite a bit of communication going on up and down the stream, right? So that there's some knowledge that they're coming.
Right.
And so one of the villages they reach everybody's left, but they come across all of this manioc, and they don't really know how to cook it. And they eat a bunch of it raw, and they eat way too much. And then a couple of the guys get incredibly sick, and a few die. And then, most of the time, it's mostly near starvation is a big problem. But their timing always seems to work out. So they end up coming into contact with some, I think they're the Machiparo people further downstream who actually have really well-organized turtle farms, right? They raise turtles in these sloughs next to the river in these sort of like what we would think of as like beaver dams, but they're man-made sloughs, and they have turtles, lots of turtles that they use not only for food, but they use the shells for making shields and things, and so so they're basically subsistence living and surviving. One of the things I was kind of confused by the more I thought about it is that they didn't take a little more time to learn how to survive off the land the way the indigenous population was. Because if you know what you're doing, you know, there's howler monkeys everywhere. There are these rodents the size of dogs, essentially, capybaras and tapirs and caiman. You know, the river's filled with pretty large alligator-like creatures called caiman, and fish. But you know, they don't have really the equipment or the wherewithal, and they're constantly being displaced and sent further downstream. So while at first I was kind of critical, like, why don't they just figure out how to, you know, kill game and fish? But then I thought, well, I mean, once they started down the river with the boat, they were never anywhere long enough to have that luxury. They're
Right.
you know, they're always ducking, you know.
Yeah. But did anybody try to like do like the Tahiti thing? Be like, hey, it's pretty sweet here. We're staying.
No, but Orellana, sir, I think he thought that enough that he was going to come back. You know, he ultimately decided when he gets to the bottom of the entire drainage, you know, and he reaches the mouth of the Amazon. They actually built another boat, and they lived on crabs and crustaceans for a couple of weeks to build this other boat. And then Orellana's plan all along was to go report this. I mean, not once he knew he had survived that leg, you know, and was off the river essentially, that he wanted to come back and claim I mean, now he's seen this, you know, thousands of miles of just what Spaniards looked at as, you know, property for us, open season empire possibility. However, no golden man. And he, you know, he may be thinking, well, the civilizations that I didn't get to see because they're beyond the Varzea, they're beyond the rainforest, in some elevated place. So he's still holding out that dream, you know.
Yeah.
But nobody sort of went rogue and said, okay, I'm going to just stay here and live with the locals.
But they did see hints of Spanish influence along the way, though. Like you pointed out a couple of times, there were I think even like Spaniards from other lost expeditions.
Well, no, they at one place I don't think that's necessarily the case. They saw things in one village that reminded them of like bishop miters, and they had heard stories. So what you're talking about is that some of the villagers told them that up this one tributary there were people who spoke Spanish, and before Orellana had gone down the Amazon, Diego Ordaz, a Spaniard who was on the conquest of Mexico with Cortez, he had made this attempt up the Orinoco, which is in Venezuela. And so, yeah, there was some, they thought that there might have been that Orellana or Diego Ordaz and some of the people who had been lost on his expedition may have survived. And the reference that I make in River of Darkness is that Cortez, in fact, did encounter en route to on Cozumel some Spaniards who had been taken prisoner on previous attempt that didn't work by the local populations, and then they were actually rescued by Cortez, and Cortez used them as interpreters, which was and that it was also the case with Cabeza de Vaca, because he was taken prisoner and then ultimately survived. But yeah, it's true that they heard tales that there may have been way upriver Spanish people who spoke like them.
It's a crazy, crazy adventure. So these guys managed to get out of there, but navigating any delta is tough. These guys just made it down all these rivers. Hell, he names the Rio Negro. They go back to Spain. How did it go in Spain, and then how did it go when he ultimately comes back on the actually fully provisioned expedition?
Right. Well, kind of a miracle that they made it to. So they take these two boats at the mouth that they've now refashioned one and built another, and managed to sail between 1,200 and 1,400 miles up the coast of South America from the mouth of the Amazon to, near the top of Venezuela, and where there was a small Spanish population. And so at that point, they were able to get better. I mean, they don't talk much about how they did that, but it took a couple, I think it took 10 days or something to 2 weeks. And they're just, had built sails out of clothing cloth. And it's just amazing that they didn't shipwreck and die.
Yeah.
But they made it all the way back to Spain. And at that point, Orellana manages to get audience with the king to describe, and he doesn't have a lot to show for it. But
right.
He convinces him that there is this remarkable land that he should go back and go upstream and with a better. So he takes a couple ships, and that ends up being an abject failure, sadly, because many of the men get scurvy on one of the ships. But Orellana took a wife while he was in Spain, a young 16-year-old woman, and he brings her with them. And they have, I think, 300 people between the two ships that they're trying to come back with. One of the ships gets blown off course and shipwrecked, and then by the time he gets to the mouth of the Amazon, many of his men are sick and with scurvy. And the problem is that it's so braided at the mouth and so large. There's an island at the mouth of the Amazon the size of Switzerland. I mean, it's just massive. And so he struggles to find the main river because there are so many braided tributaries. And so he's sailing around in there for a long, long time, for months, and becoming more and more desperate and depressed. And ultimately, they've run out of food again. And so he goes on a food finding mission. And it's really ironic because, his journey started on a food finding mission that ended up resulting in his discovery of the Amazon. But his return journey ends in a food finding mission that's a failure. And people all sort of perish on the banks, except for, I forget the number again, but a handful, including his young wife, who reports that he died of grief. I mean, he's just sort of despondent on the riverbank going, this isn't going to work,
Yeah.
And he probably starved to death.
Probably, yeah. In this whole tale, there are so many incredible things. Like, it really does seem like a work of fiction, right? But it really happened. Yeah. What stood out that didn't make the book? Because it's like, I mean, how do you even put this whole thing together? So what things did you discover that you just couldn't even fit in there because there was too much?
Oh, wow. Well, I suppose probably I tried to put it in there as much as I could, but I got so enamored with the journey down the river itself. There's a really complicated civil war going on between the Spaniards as they are dividing up the spoils. So once Gonzalo Pizarro, which I forgot to mention, he does in fact make it back to Quito, only to learn that his brother Francisco has been assassinated. then there's this huge power struggle that goes on between Gonzalo Pizarro and this other faction of Spaniards they called the Chile faction. So they were down in further south in Chile, and now the Spaniards are kind of fighting for power of this large landmass. So I mean, there's a great deal more to that story that I didn't include. I give brushstrokes to what happened, but I was more concerned with Orellana's voyage. And I suppose the other thing, which I allude to quite a bit in the epilogue, is the subsequent journeys. So that the search for the Golden Man didn't end with Orellana. It's sort of, the interest has even peaked more. So over the next 100 or 150 years or so, there are numerous other attempts to go find this Golden Man, including one by Sir Walter Raleigh, which is really, I have a kind of a, 3 or 4 page synopsis of Raleigh's journey there. It's really interesting. And then also a story that there's not that much known about. There has been a movie made about it, but I came across this story about Lope de Aguirre, who is made famous in a Werner Herzog movie called The Wrath of God, which is this, again, as these Spaniards are they're floating down the river, but they're trying to, there's all this inter-Spanish fighting, and it's really brutal. But I only was able to touch on those stories in this book, and with the notion that I may come back. I've always been really drawn to this Wrath of God story because it's brutal and really violent and just strange. But those are the main things, I suppose. The interest in the area that kept going for years and years, and then also how it opens up this land grab that ends up being not at all about El Dorado, but about other natural resources like rubber, then the cattle barons move in, and it sort of comes back to where we are today, which is that the assaults on the Amazon have not diminished, but have actually exacerbated. It's more imperiled than it ever was when, the Spaniards were there. And so that's why I wrote a new introduction to the book, which talks about the challenges that are being faced by the Amazon today.
Yeah, we just can't get enough of that Amazon basin. It's just such a crazy, crazy thing.
It's just beautiful and stupendous in its magnitude and what's still there, So I think it is important that we, one of the things I hope people get out of this book is that we have to pay attention to what's going on there because of hydroelectric dams and deforestation and overgrazing and all this stuff there are huge problems and challenges.
Yeah. Hey, everybody, the book is called River of Darkness. It's really awesome. I completely enjoyed it, and I'm going to read more of Buddy's books because you do such a great job, man. I truly, anybody, go get that book for reals. Anything in closing, Buddy? Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Yeah, I just want to say thanks for having me, and I'm really excited about the release of the book. I want more people to have a chance to read the story and be as thrilled about it as I was in writing it, and hopefully get a kind of vicarious journey down the Amazon that I was lucky enough to have. And then last, that I have another book coming out in December. Maybe we can get back together, but
yes, we will.
And it's a second Arctic book called Empire of Ice and Stone, about the Canadian Arctic expedition in 1913. And so I'd love to swing back around and chat with you about that.
No, that would be great. I can't wait to hear it and read it. Thank you so much for coming on. Stand by for one more.